Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program for the promotion of learning and virtue, moral education in the university. Please welcome Heritage President Dr. Kevin Roberts.
Good evening. Thanks for being here. Those of you who've joined us online, thanks for doing that as well. You're in for a treat tonight because amid all of the challenges, and I'm told there are a few in the United States today, one of the best solutions, in fact, I often argue, the solution to most of those challenges is to improve our education. And if we're going to improve our education, we have to improve the funding model, as we like to say at the Heritage Foundation. We are, after all, a think tank, which is to say we need universal school choice. But even once we implement universal school choice, that's right, once we implement universal school choice, not if, across the fruited plain, we also have to have an education approach that is suitable for a virtuous, informed citizenry. And that means for those of us who've spent some time in classical education, the time has come for those of us who support universal school choice to talk about what's going on, not just in the classrooms, but in those places where we formulate curricula, where we formulate the very approach to education. And so it's a real pleasure to host you here tonight to facilitate any conversation on education, but particularly this one on the importance of moral education in the university. And we have three leaders with us tonight, each of whom has dedicated his career to that very question, which is ultimately a question that's devoted to human flourishing, how it is in the United States, the most pluralistic society in the history of mankind, that essentially guarantees to each of its citizens equal access to the finest education in the history of the world. Very noble aspiration, has been imperfectly applied, obviously, in our history. The time has come in the 21st century to make it the century when, in fact, we fulfill that noble objective. We've gotten a lot of the laws right, finally, after 150 or 200 years of struggle. Now it's time to perfect the approach in the university. So each of these gentlemen you will enjoy hearing from, and I'll introduce them in turn, and then they will join me on stage as a group. First is Dr. Albert Cheng, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Education Reform at the University of Arkansas. In addition to that work, he is someone who leads the Classical Education Lab. He'll talk a little bit about that effort. It's an opportunity for us with Dr. Cheng to hear about what's going on at the higher education level, but particularly also some of the work at the K-12 level, because we have to have good K-12 schools who are, of course, providing students for a moral education in the university. And then joining Albert is his former colleague from the University of Arkansas, in fact, the founder of that Department of Education Reform, Dr. Jay Greene. I'm happy to say, rather pleased to say, that the Heritage Foundation stole Jay away from the University of Arkansas. He's now here at Heritage as a senior fellow in education policy and reform. Jay not only writes many articles, but I have often said, and I mean it, Jay, I really do when I say this, in addition to being so charming and lovable, that if Jay Greene runs a set of data, if he analyzes a set of data, take it to the bank that it's real. That's true for anyone at Heritage, I would say, but Jay's studies on the impact of education reform really are, for those of us who are education reformers, very important. But what I love about Jay being on this panel is that in addition to that statistical work, to the work that he does in helping to formulate good legislation in state by state, he cares most deeply about one thing, and that's the moral education in the university. So we're honored that Jay's here with us tonight. Of course, honored to count him as a colleague here. And then very special for me, in addition to my friendship with Jay and new friendship with Dr. Cheng, is my longtime friend of a decade or more, Kyle Washut, who is the fourth president at a great institution called Wyoming Catholic College. I was the second president there. Kyle was my colleague there, academic dean. Kyle is the person I said as we were departing Wyoming for Texas, as I was making the move into public policy, one day you need to be president of this institution. And he said, why? I said, you understand classical education, you understand the moral education in the university, you are a Wyoming native, and remember, Kyle, you started washing dishes at what was called the Wyoming School of Thought, which was the precursor to Wyoming Catholic College. And then you became a student of Dr. Bob Carlson, one of the co-founders of the college. You knew the other co-founder, Father Robert Cook, the first president. You went to Thomas Aquinas College, a sister school of Wyoming Catholic. And you also are a wonderful theologian and a great father. So join me in welcoming these three gentlemen to the stage. We'll get into some hard questions from the audience in a little while. But before we get into questions, or specific questions rather, I just want each of you to give us a sense of the landscape as you see it, about higher education generally, but particularly the question for us tonight, which is how do we improve the moral education in the university? Dr. Cheng, we'll start with you.
Yeah, well, I'd say we need to bring it back. So
Good start.
So it used to be that institutions of higher education would require courses in moral education. And in those courses, students would learn and talk about normative ethics. And that's just gone the way of the dinosaur these days. That doesn't happen. In fact, what you have in place instead are things like applied ethics, which just kind of get students and college students to reason through things, maybe moral dilemmas, but then it doesn't really make them wrestle with normative questions. I mean, I could go on about all sorts of other things going on in K-12 ed, but maybe I'll start there and say, hey, we got to bring this back and bring serious discussion and consideration of normative ethics back into the classroom at the college level.
Thanks. Jay, what would you add to that?
So I think a central problem is actually a lack of responsibility. So irresponsibility undermines moral education because there are natural consequences to bad decisions or good decisions. And if people are insulated from the consequences of their decisions, they don't learn these natural consequences, and they're undermined in their ability to acquire moral education. And so there are multiple layers of irresponsibility in higher education. There's excess subsidy, there's a lack of discipline for bad behavior on the part of university administrators, and all of these are creating a world of consequence-free education, but that means morality-free education, and I think that's something that we need to address.
Thanks. Kyle, for you, as you tackle this question, I'm deeply interested in your sense of the landscape broadly, but I think for our audience, whether in person or online, it may be helpful for them too to hear about the particular approach that Wyoming Catholic has taken to this question.
So let me start by just the landscape broadly. One of the reasons we started Wyoming Catholic College was precisely in response to a crisis of moral education, both at the level of are we teaching it actually in schools, but also at the level of is the culture or the community in which you would even be studying it the kind of place conducive to growing in virtue. And I think when you look at what happens on your average campus, you realize quickly, no, these are not places of moral seriousness, right? These are places of frat parties and on one side, radicalism on the other, or extreme isolation. And that's only gotten worse since COVID. So that when you look now at the landscape, you say, all right, we have a place where we don't study education, or we don't study virtue, we don't see examples of virtue before us in the experience of the institution, and we don't let our students grow in a community that would be conducive to growing virtue. So Wyoming Catholic College, we're going to do something relatively radical. We're committed to having a deliberately small college because we think in part real community on a human scale is important for moral formation. We want them to have consequences, and so we're going to go out into the wilderness where we're in rural Lander, Wyoming, which is already fairly rural. But then we're going to send the students out. They spend 10 weeks over the course of their 4 years doing various wilderness activities, hiking, backpacking, whitewater rafting, with very real consequences, very real risks, and learning real responsibility and teamwork. And then we put them on horseback for a semester as well, so they can learn responsibility for an animal. And then within that community, we create a community of moral responsibility. There's real standards, real things that need to be upheld. And then given that environment, we're going to do things like study Aristotle's ethics or have this conversation. So I think that it is both what we are doing, but also a response to what the situation is on the larger scale.
How many in the audience want to go to Wyoming Catholic College? One of the most common things we've heard there, right? So, Jay, I want to take a step back or several from wonderful but small Lander, Wyoming, and look at the country at large as it relates to the point you made regarding responsibility. What in most institutions of higher education have their administrations, their boards, their faculty done to contribute to this systemic problem of irresponsibility in the institutions?
Well, I mean, a specific problem we have is the embrace of critical theory, which tries to divide the world into oppressor and oppressed, and everyone by their group identity can be placed in those categories. And this is, first, it's totally antithetical to traditional American values, which would embrace equal treatment under the law and the treatment of people as individuals rather than as members of groups. But it also leads to an unlimited or boundless bad behavior, because nothing that the individual does is the reason for their treatment. It's simply what the group has done. And therefore, there's no limit to how roughly you could treat a person other than what you think the badness of their group is or the goodness of their group is. And so this leads to some very monstrous behavior. And we've seen this on campus in the last several weeks, where large groups of students are marching around chanting genocidal slogans, and we're seeing faculty join and encourage, and we're seeing administrators being quite craven, frankly, and cowardly in their response. And I don't think it's because the administrators themselves are deeply ideological. I just think that they have no deep commitment to principle at all, and they are fearful of those students. And so we have a very bad situation of immoral young people running our universities when we could use responsible adults in charge.
And we'll come back to at least one element of that answer, Jay, and that is some specific proposals that we've made at Heritage about how to use the approach to moral education in the university to combat anti-Semitism. We knew this was a problem. Obviously, all of us in the United States now know that this is a problem, not just in the Middle East, but unfortunately right here in the United States and across the West. Before we do that, though, Albert, I want to shift gears temporarily and talk about K-12, because I know that's on the minds of everyone in the audience, whether they have kids in those grade levels or not, because it's vital to the future of our society. Have you seen that same level of irresponsibility institutionalized in K-12 schools that Jay has explained exists in higher ed?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how, if it's the same kind of thing. I mean, certainly the administrators and folks on school boards, I mean, they're responding to similar political pressures with their constituents as well. And so I suspect something similar is going on there. But, you were mentioning classical education earlier, and I think that, look, I mean, someone once made the claim to me that classical education is going to save the world, and as someone that is really leery of overpromising anything. I was really skeptical at first, and then now, with each passing day, I'm like, maybe this person was right.
I say that almost every day.
Oh, well, great. But and the reason I think that is there's something fundamentally different about what's going on in these schools, and that you hear anecdotally, and that students that go through classical education somehow get inoculated from critical theory and basically illogical things and whatever is politically popular these days, that they think for themselves, they can think independently, they can think well, which if you're familiar with the essay, it's a speech from Dorothy Sayers, but now an essay, Lost Tools of Learning. She was writing about British education in the aftermath of World War II. And she said, we need to recover of grammar, of logic, of rhetoric. And she was asking the question, why is it that entire populations just kind of gave way to German propaganda? And I think we live in a similar time today, and I think the revival of classical education today is responding to similar trends. And so, you've got graduates that I wish I could do more empirical research about this, bring some more data to bear on this, but anecdotally, graduates of classical schools, they seem to be inoculated from every whim that's being tossed to and fro these days. Or to just put it a different way, if you let me, I heard one person say that in classical education, students become good hobbits. It's because when the ring comes to them, they know what to do with it, right? That you can't really shield people from coming across the ring, right? But when they do come across it, they know what to do.
If you know, you know.
Yeah. But it comes through formation, right?
It does.
It's all the the moral formation that we're talking about is pivotal to forming people, such that they're these kinds of people where they can recognize truth from falsehood, goodness from evil, so on and so forth.
So I want to ask a follow-up question,
Yep.
and then we'll get back to Kyle and Jay and you on some higher education questions. But this is a question that I'm just going to presume is on behalf of some members of the audience, because when I started a K through 12 classical school and then became president at Wyoming Catholic, probably the most common question I got from parents, sometimes from donors, was, well, what is it?
Yeah.
Education. Which is a way of saying from that person, and this would be most Americans, right? Well, I never got that. Or I don't think I ever got that. And their quote unquote skepticism actually is just an ignorance in the best sense of that term. There's just a lack of knowledge about it. What's the elevator pitch?
What's the elevator? How long's the elevator ride?
1 minute. It's a tall story.
And I'm using
Academic to academic. I'm gonna time you.
Well, so I'll make one point. First point is that
2
this
seconds
used
left.
to be mainstream. That all these texts, classic texts, great books, used to be the things folks read multiple generations ago, and then that just kind of got lost in the curriculum over the past century. But really, what I would say is it's an education in truth, in goodness and beauty, right? Acquainting students with that, and in knowing that, wisdom and virtue flow from that, right? That if you know what's real, you know what's good, know what's true, right? Part of engagement with that is what forms you into a virtuous person. And all the engagement with the text, the learning, right? It's oriented to shaping you, not just your head and your mind, but your hands, your heart, to be oriented to those three things, to love, truth, goodness, and beauty.
Man, we had some time left. Yeah. Nice job. Do you have tenure yet?
Soon.
Well, yeah. I think
Probably-
it's under due process right now. So.
Yeah, you probably don't want the president of the Heritage Foundation asking you about your tenure. But you work at a great, fair institution, and you do great work. Kyle Washut, you have been and still are a faculty member and now president of your college. One of the criticisms of classical education and or of moral education in the university is that for faculty members, it must somehow abridge academic freedom. How true is that?
So I think the thing to remember as we think about the question of any kind of freedom, but this is true about academic freedom as well, is that if there are disagreements, there have to be a way to resolve them. And typically in the history of education, the way we have understood we resolve disagreements about what is good or what is true is because we're capable of knowing what is good and what is true and acting accordingly. And therefore, we can resolve our disagreements by a meeting of the minds, real arguments, giving of positions, real demonstrations. And that's where you get lively intellectual academic debate. When you say there isn't truth, or there's not truth that's accessible, or the only truth or goodness that matters is one of identity of who's the privileged group or who's the oppressed group and how are we rectifying that, then there's no actual academic solution to the problem. Then the only solution is one of power. And so if we actually want academic freedom, a commitment to the reality of truth and the reality of goodness is the goal of education, is the only way to get it.
How many colleges and universities in the United States would you say are either classical or have a morally appropriate approach to their education?
Jay might know the actual number more than I. I think it's small. I think that's why people come all the way out to the mountains of Wyoming, is they don't just turn to their neighborhood college and have the opportunity to have a community that's devoted to truth and goodness. You have to go to wild, out-of-the-way places to get it. Sometimes there's exceptions, sometimes there's great departments. But the overwhelming weight of the propaganda and the entire engine and funding and system that has created the current higher ed monstrosity in America makes it really hard to find places that are actually committed to genuine academic freedom and goodness.
That's so true. So Jay, Kyle wants to phone a friend who's a statistician, and that would be you. Any sense of the number of schools in either of those categories?
I agree with Kyle. I think it's it rounds to zero. It's
not just fewer than 100.
You're right.
It's fewer than 50.
Right. I mean, it feels like we're bargaining in Sodom. If there are 10 righteous people to save the higher education system, and I'm not sure that there are. And I actually think that most universities are beyond reform. I don't think it should be our project to rescue them, because I think they're too far gone.
So what do we do?
Well, I mean. The first thing that we might do is to stop fueling bad things. So, stop digging when you're in a hole. So let's stop. Donors should be going on donor strikes. I have no idea why anyone is giving to these bad acting universities. They should stop. They shouldn't imagine that their gift is the gift that will turn them around. It won't happen that way. That's a mistake. Give to, and I think the second thing is that we're going to need to build some new universities on new principles. I think Wyoming College Catholic College is an example of that type of effort. But frankly, we need 50 of these. And there was
so it doesn't take 3,000. It takes a few dozen.
And we have the money. This is not a financial problem. This is a matter of will. The wealthy people of the late 19th century founded a whole set of universities because they were dissatisfied with American universities at the time. They thought they were insufficiently attentive to sciences. And rather than donating labs to Princeton and Harvard, they built new universities, University of Chicago, Stanford, and they competed with them, and they helped improve the older institutions that existed. And I think we similarly need to build new if we have any hope to reform old. And there's no reason why the super rich of today couldn't do it as the super rich of then did.
And to your point, so many of the colleges today we recognize as not just the best institutions academically in this country, but in the world, were founded 400 years ago, by almost 400 years ago, by people with similar motivations, to your point. And there have been these inflection points. You've talked about a couple of other eras where that's happened. There's no reason, just to underscore your point, there's no reason we ought not have that mentality right now. And obviously, we think there's some work that can be done in public policy. We'll touch on that a little bit before we turn to audience questions. One of those elements of public policy, Dr. Cheng, has got to be what we do with DEI programs. What's the effect of them at the average state university, and how do we fix it?
Yeah, I mean, well, I haven't had personal run-ins with all this myself, so I consider myself quite fortunate. But I think this is really Jay's question. I mean, he's the one that's studied this and dug up all sorts of data. I mean, you counted the bureaucracies and you.
You'll keep wanting to go to the numbers.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a numbers guy too. I just don't have those numbers.
Yeah, I mean, we had a series of 3 studies at Heritage when I first arrived. The DEI trilogy: diversity, university, equity, elementary, and inclusion, delusion, in order. It was a thing
Who was the headline writer on that?
it was a thing of beauty. So we counted how big these bureaucracies are. We counted how they're spreading into K-12 schools and negatively affecting achievement. And then we also documented 2 years ago how they were shockingly high in levels of anti-Semitism. And at the time, people did not believe it. Now it's conventional wisdom. And it's horrible that a bad thing has to happen in the world for people to begin to recognize things, but it's a positive development because it means that people see the problem and they can begin to work towards solutions.
So follow-up question, very much related. You would think, I would imagine many Americans innocently think the following, that diversity, equity, inclusion sounds okay. We've kind of disabused them of that. But we understand why they might think that just because of the words, they're okay. And then they might think until recent protests that are anti-Semitic that having a DEI program would prevent that kind of thing. But it's created the exact opposite problem. How do we fix it? And in particular, how do we do it quickly enough that this scourge of anti-Semitism can, if not be brought to a close once and for all, at least be mitigated?
So DEI was created by excess funding. I mean, in fact, we show in another a study that I did with John Schuffer on indirect costs, which are that's the overhead rate charged on federal grants, which is super high, and it's a huge source of funding for especially selective universities. The bigger the indirect revenue, the bigger the DEI. So they use it to fuel. It's a slush fund for administrators that they can use for whatever is bureaucratically and politically advantageous for them. And one of those things was build a DEI bureaucracy, and then you get to check that box to move up to the higher post somewhere else, or you get to use them as shock troops to denounce your enemies and take their spots. I mean, it honestly, present company accepted, university administrators resemble East German bureaucrats of the 1980s.
I gather that's not a compliment.
No. And so there's a ruthlessness there, but the ruthlessness was fueled by our tax money. And if we begin to starve the beast of money by donor strikes, by cutting back on excess subsidy from the public treasury, they will begin to eliminate. The first things they'll eliminate are the things that are the most wasteful, and DEI will be among them. It's not that they have an ideological commitment to them. They don't. They'll ditch them if we put pressure on them to ditch them and if we cut the money. And so and it's happening. This is already happening. Florida, Texas are already beginning to have taken steps to abolish DEI. Iowa, their own board of trustees just announced that they were going to do this. We can do this, and we can make progress on this. Now, I don't think it's going to produce the kind of moral education that we're talking about here, but it will make the problem less bad in our legacy institutions.
So, thank you. So, Dr. Cheng, we perhaps have run the risk of depressing our audience by talking about how few of these schools exist. And so I'm going to lean on you and your numbers to tell us what is the most exciting, hopeful aspect of the future of education based on your research.
So, one of the things we do at the Classical Education Research Lab is to try to get a pulse on the landscape of the classical education movement. And so it actually gives me a lot of hope. We recently fielded the survey with an association, a national association. And, if you go to these conferences, national conferences where these school leaders and teachers gather for professional training and networking, everyone just kind of, at the coffee refreshment area, they all say like, wow, parents are interested in this, it's picking up, it's growing. And the question is it just isolated cases, or is this happening nationally? So in the survey, we found that 1 in 5 schools have been founded within the last 5 years. Okay, and so nationally, like new schools are being founded, classical schools at the K-12 level. Actually, in Northwest Arkansas, we're up to 4 new classical schools in the last 6 years. Actually did a study of classical charter schools in Texas. In the past 10 years, the charter sector in Texas has always been pretty healthy. Enrollment has doubled in the past 10 years for the charter sector as a whole. If you look at classical charter schools alone as a segment, student enrollment for that sector has grown sevenfold in the past 10 years. And so I think at the K-12 level, there's this groundswell that's coming. And of course, I mean, it actually is kind of this a call to all of us to steward this movement and invest in it and grow it. But I think what's happening at K-12 is reason for hope, because these are going to be graduates, these are going to be students that not only know how to think well, but I don't know that Wyoming Catholic's going to be able to handle all of them that are looking for a liberal education at the K-12 level.
And yet, not only did you offer some real substantive hopefulness, you've also indicated that we really have reason to expect there to be the same kind of demand at the higher education level as there is at the K through 12 level. So Kyle Washut, last question from me for all of you now before we turn to the audience. What lessons have you and your colleagues at Wyoming Catholic College drawn about your approach to education that are transferable to either an existing institution or, who knows, who's here in the audience or watching tonight or sometime down the road, where they're going to use this panel and your piece of advice on how to approach building their new institution?
So I'd say first and foremost is the thing we've already been touching on. Radical reform of higher ed is necessary. And a willingness to do two things: to commit to radical moral education and a radical commitment to truth, require a kind of break with things that we assume are typical of the higher ed model. That you do not need to be dependent on federal funding. You do not need to kowtow to DEI. You do not need to be in the same established circles to do a college education. Just like 15 years ago, it was really hard to convince people that classical education startups were a good thing for K through 12. We're still on the front end of that for the colleges, but it is absolutely possible, and it's absolutely vital. The other thing I think is that it's really, really important, whatever we do with education. One of the things we haven't hit as a driving force behind the radicalizing that happens on campus is the isolation and the radicalizing that happens because of the increasing reliance on social media and absorption into phones and technology on your average college campus. Your average college campus now is very often an experience of loneliness in a dorm, absorption in interaction with avatars on a screen, and that's what you do. But if what's necessary for reforming education is authentic human community on a human scale committed to truth and goodness, you've got to turn off the screens in some way. Now, at Wyoming Catholic College, they just give up their phone. Maybe that can't happen at every college campus, but some way turn off the screen and in some way put the students in an encounter with the wilds of nature with real consequences and real responsibility. Whether that's 10 weeks while living in a rural mountain town, maybe not everyone's lucky enough to do that. But something like that needs to happen at every college campus.
Yeah, great response. Thanks, gentlemen. So I might have one more question for you all at the end, but we're going to turn to the audience, and we just have one rule. Please phrase your long comment in the form of a short question. So raise your hand. The mics will come to you. Those are necessary for at least one of us on the stage to hear your question and for everyone who is tuned in online. Ma'am, you get the first question. Microphone's coming your way.
Yeah, today I learned about the horrors that are known as Ohio State University. And in addition to the 189 DEI employees at $20 million a year, the faculty was required to take a test to see if they adhere to that ideology in every single subject matter, like biology or whatever. I was wondering if you'd be able to talk to us about how many colleges are having these kinds of tests throughout their university so that we can understand just how widespread the problem is.
Jay, everyone's looking at you.
So there are trainings, and the trainings have little tests at the end. So maybe that's what you're referring to. So they're mandatory DEI training at most institutions in the United States. Although, I mean, they're not very good, right? So I used to be hopeful that none of this would be really dangerous because kids didn't really learn it. You know, it's kind of bad. And so, like, it's really hard to indoctrinate people with really bad quality stuff. And I think I falsely reassured my own children. Oh, don't worry, all the other kids who are spotting crazy stuff, they'll just grow out of it. They'll go off into jobs. It will impose a responsibility on them, and they'll become normal. And that turned out not to be true. I was wrong. So I don't think it's that our universities are brainwashing into the nonsense, but what they're doing is they're facilitating an irresponsibility that is perpetuating this nonsense, allowing it to spread. And then somehow employment is doing the same. Especially government sector is a highly irresponsible sector that welcomes. So the State Department is populated with people with crazy ideas. Why? Because there's no consequence to being wrong. But that, to just quickly get back to your question, how widespread it is, it's near universal that there is some sort of DEI orthodoxy being enforced in public universities and private universities across the country. It's near universal.
Next question. Yes. The dapper gentleman thing, the far end of the row. My colleague, Dr. Jay Richards.
So some of us, probably a lot of us in the room that are parents, have been beneficiaries, at least for our children, of this kind of education. But I've constantly reminded that it feels very much like a luxury good. And two of you mentioned briefly the idea that at some point, if it becomes prevalent enough, there'll be competitive pressure on the state schools and the other schools that are a disaster. I mean, what needs to happen? What's that threshold where you could actually have competitive pressure?
Kyle, you want to start?
Yeah, I think at some level we're starting to see that break now. It's what Jay was saying. What needs to happen first, and it's going to be private individuals before the gears of government kick in here, is to turn the funding spigot off. And that there are a number of very wealthy individuals that are propping up this situation, such that for most state universities and certainly of the big legacy schools, tuition is a gatekeeping tool. It's not actually what funds the bizarre operation. I think if we can turn off the spigot there and get people genuinely to start investing in, I think there are more than zero colleges out there that are genuinely doing real attempts at this. And there are all sorts of people in America who keep giving money to their alma mater because that's what you do. And if they turn off the spigot and they start investing in these radical colleges that are actually taking a stand, that are actually helping build a country that they want to live in, then I think we see that turning this from, oh, this is a pie-in-the-sky elite dream, to this is becoming a normative thing that's a real option for folks. It's what happened with the classical ed schools K through 12, and I think we're going to see that happen. But we need the donors in some ways to lead the way.
Albert, would you like to weigh in?
I mean, so, certainly at the K-12 level, as we see universal school choice programs being passed, I mean, to invoke Churchill after El Alamein, right? I think this is the end of the beginning because, getting the law and policy right is just that. And it's really up to schools now to step up. So I'm on the board of a local classical school in Fayetteville, Arkansas. We're 3 years old. And so, we're qualifying. We have some students on the LEARNS Act money there. And we're discovering, wow, it actually takes a lot of effort to invite these students in, and there's a little bit of an administrative burden, but our hearts are there, and we realize, like, just kind of magically waving a magic wand to to open up a new classroom and find a new teacher and find more space. It's not magic, and so it takes a lot of work. So really, I think the opportunity is there before us, and that competitive pressure I think that you're referencing earlier will show up, but there's still a lot of hard work to be done, and I think it's an all hands on deck task that's before us.
Thank you. Yes, sir, all the way in the back. Right there.
Thank you all for what you're doing in education. Get new teachers. You mentioned it, Albert, just a second ago. That seems to me to be the spigot problem. What policy solutions, what cultural adaptations, how do we get more teachers who know what they're doing in this field in a hurry, which seems to be the major slow up?
Albert?
Yeah, I'll weigh in on that. So Jay and I didn't talk beforehand, but I'm of the opinion that we need to build new teacher training institutions. That your traditional schools of education, they're not going to train your teachers that are going to staff schools that are in the liberal tradition. And so fortunately there's efforts going on. I mean, University of Dallas is a big one, actually just down the road in Tulsa where I'm at. There's a new honors college. Jennifer Frey, Matthew Post, just some folks in the movement are starting a new honors college. And so there's some thought there about, hey, can we seed the next generation of teachers to staff these schools? Actually, I'll just give a shout out to actually another University of Arkansas alumni. Michael McShane at EdChoice just did a study on the teacher pipeline. And the takeaway in that study, after reviewing schools of ed and surveying teachers, is that these traditional programs aren't at all preparing teachers to teach in private schools, let alone classical schools. We need content experts. We need people who understand the tradition, who understand, have a different imaginary about education, a different educational paradigm. You're not going to get that with what we have now. And so, again, lots of hard work to be done in building institutions to eventually seed these new schools for generations to come.
I've got 3 really quick policy proposals that I think we should do to take advantage of schools like Wyoming Catholic College, like University of Dallas, that are producing these greatly educated, well-formed students that want to go into the education field. First, I think states or districts should remove the requirement that you have an education degree, right? You get a great degree in the liberal arts or something, and you're very equipped to communicate effectively. I think states should also, as part of school choice programs, be willing to forgive the student debt of young men and women who teach there, especially in some of these classical schools. Currently, there's a lot of debt forgiveness programs that are tied to teaching in the public school system, which is well and good. But these classical schools, again, building fresh, if we're going to have school choice programs, I think maybe some debt relief for the young men and women who go to places like University of Dallas, Wyoming Catholic College, and want to teach and help build up are going to be really key. And third, I think being able to somehow fast track students in some way to effectively recruit them, again, with some kind of policy support in the way that they're doing for public school support, but looking for supporting these rising schools are going to be really key for helping get better teachers there.
So much in the education model writ large has to change. And I'll just channel my inner Jay Greene, actually I'll channel all of us at the Heritage Foundation and say, for us, it starts with eliminating root and branch the U.S. Department of Education. Because if we succeed in doing that, yes, you ought to applaud for that. I was just doing an interview with a reporter for a major outlet, and he was asking about our Project 2025. I promise this is related, gentlemen, about presidential transition. And he said, well, what do you think about this proposal from one candidate about a national teacher licensure program? And I said, we hate it. He said, could you be clearer? What do you think about such and such through the Department of Education? I said, we hate it. He said, why do you hate these things? I said, because we want the department to go away. There's a certain consistency here, but if you're sitting, especially in Kyle's chair, that could be really helpful. But it would be helpful for, of course, everyone in education. Yes, ma'am, you've been very patient. The microphone's right next to you.
So much. To your point, Dr. Roberts, scholastically, how would an employer even be interested in a student, as I'm watching Stanford lower their expectation of students entering college? Why would an employer even want to hire these students once they're graduated from school? I mean, if we put the emphasis on scholastically competing with these woke, for lack of a better word, woke agenda schools, like I can't imagine their SATs and their scores are that high comparatively to an institution such as the gentleman from Wyoming with the boots and cowboy hat. Sorry.
Jay, you want to tackle that?
I think this is beginning to change. Employers are beginning to notice that there are problems with simply relying upon universities as their HR department. Basically, they screen for two things: cognitive ability, so highly selective schools do demand high achievement test scores, which are kind of IQ proxies, right? And employers are not allowed to administer IQs, but they can use the universities as a screening tool. And then they also screen for kind of a non-cognitive skill of perseverance. So do you show up? Do you complete assignments? Do you follow directions? Can you complete tasks? These are things employers want too. Universities screen for this too. Now this is, an incredibly expensive, inefficient job interview tool. And we don't need it for that. And so I think employers are gonna begin to look for more efficient and more precise methods going forward, especially as the non-cognitive things that they were hoping to screen for are no longer present. I don't think they're screening for people who follow directions, complete tasks, and so on. I think they're getting the opposite.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, ma'am. Yes, sir.
This is supposed to get to method, but in teaching on morals, it seems we have the chance now to use examples. In the politics of it, the Clintons used post-Constitution. Now, I would say they set the example how not to set an example. Barack Obama has a book, A Promised Land, and yet we question that. So if do we now have two examples that we have to challenge to raise the morals? And would originalism be the separation of church and state leaves that America would be a promised land for people of Scripture, that they left the jurisdiction of under God, so everyone's under their Creator, right from Creator. So it's how do you use the examples for teaching the morals, and are we at a time where we actually have political examples of what not to do, and just by raising up the discussion of what is actually the constitutionalism versus what was the politics?
Kyle?
So that is one of the things that I didn't mention in our initial discussion, is that one of the key traditional ways of moral teaching is the tradition you're part of has certain stories that illustrate and embody the morals and the values of the society. Part of what the commitment to DEI has led us to is ridiculing those examples or talking about why they're examples of privilege or oppression or various things. It is a real challenge, I think, in a society where we don't have common stories, whether it's the biblical narrative, whether it's the great epics of the Greeks and the Romans, to be able to look to and inspire folks and say, this is what it means to be a hero, this is what it means to be a good citizen. So again, not to unduly toot our own horn, but to toot our own horn. At Wyoming Catholic College, we certainly do a lot of storytelling, a lot of these examples, a lot of this passing on of the tradition, because that's actually what moves the heart. C.S. Lewis talks about, if you just talk about the idea, you don't actually get morally formed people that follow through on tasks. You've got to inflame their chest, give them an education of the heart, so they really act. And I think any education of morals is going to really depend on giving those stories that probably most of us in this room think are important, think really move you and inspire you. And all education, K through 12, but also college, needs to pass on those stories, absolutely.
We have time for a couple more questions. Gentlemen, all the way to the side. Microphone's coming your way. Oh, you sir. Yes, you.
Thank you. Some Republican politicians have seemed to suggest higher education reform go in somewhat of the opposite direction toward trades and STEM that might not leave room for classical education. So what's the role in a system for an increased emphasis on classical education at the same time an increased emphasis on trades and filtering out young people into non-liberal arts areas?
Albert, you want to take the lead?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. I'm curious what Kyle does at his school. Curious about that. But I'll say that the two I don't think are mutually exclusive. That I know if you invoke Aristotle, talk about liberal arts versus servile arts, and there seems to be a separation there. But I don't know that they have to be separate. And in fact, I would say to do well at a particular vocation requires moral understanding. Just take engineering, for instance. I think a lot of institutions these days, if you bracket, away, set aside the moral part of it, all they're about engineering is simply, can I build something? But there's a more important question of, should you build that thing? Are there certain things we ought not to build? And so I think whatever the vocation, whatever the trade, there has to be some moral training, moral formation there to actually do that well. Of course, how do you strike that balance? I guess that's a separate question.
Right.
But I don't know if Kyle has a...
Yeah, I absolutely echo that, right? The idea that somehow training someone to be honest and not embezzle is not training them to be a good employee is a weird idea, right? We all implicitly assume that being a good human person is an important part of being a good employee. I don't want them to steal from me. I don't want them to, say hurtful things in an angry way or, whatever the case may be. But we also ironically think that somehow we might need to spend 5 years of intense study and practice to begin to be an engineer, but seemingly we'll pick up being a good person on the side in an environment that, as we've already said, is not at all conducive to that. So step one, I think we need to say it is important to do moral formation, and it is worth investing in that moral formation heavily. And it's worth investing in it heavily, not just at K through 12, but even at that adult entry into the workforce level. That being said, there's all sorts of creative things one can do beyond that, and we're constantly experimenting at Wyoming Catholic College with what that might look like. Are there summer internships we can do for practical training? Are there work you can have for some amount of time during the week where you're apprenticing in a particular trade? Are there things like that you can do? The thing we don't want to say is that somehow that's of equal import to training morally good people, or that somehow we could cut some corners on moral training so that this person's a more efficient craftsman. That it doesn't matter how good of a craftsman is if they're a lousy human being, and we don't want to cut corners there.
Final question, dapper gentleman in the center.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roberts. So I imagine you all are familiar with a recent book written by a noted jurisprudential scholar, Hadley Arcas, on mere natural law. And I wonder, natural law, his argument is that it undergirds our entire constitutional system, even though it's not written into the Constitution, it undergirds it. Do you see this as a component in restoring higher education in the line of morality?
Jay, you want to start?
Oh, I was going to defer to others.
I'm just used to you having an answer to everything.
That's true. Bad quality.
It's not a bad quality.
So, I think that we could potentially point to any kind of one big idea as the one thing everyone must know, I think that there are kind of competing one big ideas that we might have undergirding our system. So I'm not sure I'd want to go all in. And even our understanding of natural law is not. We don't have consensus on that. So, let me quick pivot and just answer quickly the last question also, which I think might help, which is maybe oddly, the way to fix education is to have less of it. That the problem is education itself. And that this pivot towards vocational is really a pivot away from abstract education and make it concrete. People learn trades. But in doing things with consequences, you might actually acquire a moral foundation better than through mere abstractions and kind of formal education and abstract thinking. And it's possible that that would be consistent with a tilt towards natural law as well. So just a thought for...
A lot of food for thought there. So thank you. Kyle, I imagine you probably want to advocate for natural law.
Absolutely.
And it's disappointing to me that 57 minutes into this panel, we discover a point of contention. We love debate at the Heritage Foundation, but as it is.
There it is. So I get to give one of our great taglines at Wyoming Catholic College. One of the reasons we like putting the students out in the wilderness is we say that what's happening there is they're encountering God's first book, which is ultimately a kind of natural law claim, that written in the foundations of the creation are certain foundational principles that you learn experientially first, before abstractly. And I think fundamentally that does undergird moral formation. Now, if you just try to do it by, I'm going to memorize the big book of natural law, you're actually missing what natural law is, right? Natural law can't just be simply translated into the book. Natural law is fundamentally experienced with real consequences in real communities at a real human scale. I think, ideally, in the wilderness at times. That, I think, does undergird. Otherwise, if nature isn't what undergirds moral theory, then it's merely convention. Then it is really a question of who gets to be the privileged person in charge, who gets to say what we do. The only way to completely avoid the DEI privileged power struggle is to say there's something undergirding that can be universally experienced, and that's found in the created world, and we're going to say that's natural law.
So lightning round. Told you I might ask one more question, I will. And it's under the category of something that we try to do here at Heritage with all of our panels, hopefully all of our research, and that is we can talk about abstract things to some extent. Parts of this conversation were by design, moral education in the university. But we try to conclude by pointing not just to hopefulness, but what each of us can do, given our respective stations in life. And so the question is, what one practical thing that is practical for just people in this audience can someone do to contribute to the moral education in the university? It could be reading a book, it could be participating in some activity, but I'm curious to hear on behalf of the audience what each of you will say. Dr. Cheng?
I'll step back and go to the K-12 world and say, get involved. Volunteer. New school, help build a school, help a new school, get in the classroom. I now know it's really hard work to do it, and we're always looking for people to step in. And it's going to take every one of us to do their part.
But when we're talking about reclaiming a country, that isn't just at the ballot box.
No.
Not just in the courtroom. It's not just in the halls of Congress. Those are important. The really important work is what you just described. Right. So I really appreciate that response. Dr. Greene?
So I think all of us can do something to help impose consequences on bad behavior.
You're really focused on discipline today.
For example, many of us are employers or have some role in that. Stop hiring bad people. Just go out of your way to decide that there are people that you just don't want working around you. This used to have a name blacklist, which is not well thought of. We could call it name and shame, and then it's more reputable. But we need to name and shame bad actors in university settings, both both faculty, staff, and students, and shun them. And that's part of how you get more moral behavior is by shunning badness.
Thank you. I appreciate that. President Washut.
So I think one of the things we've hit on is that part of the problem facing higher education is that unlike at the 19th century where there was this active agency and we can reform this, we kind of take the current mess as at least in some way the status quo. And so I think the first thing we need to do is try to reawaken our minds to a way of reconceiving what higher education might be. And to that, I'd say there's a book that's worth reading, or any number of books or essays worth reading, but they're not about higher education per se. They're by Wendell Berry. And I think Wendell Berry does this great job of making us rethink what exactly the role of wealth is, what the role of technology is, what the role of community is in human existence, simply speaking. And if we can recalibrate those properly, then we can better have the conversation with our children, with young people we know, with donors you're trying to convince to donate to Wyoming Catholic College, whoever it may be, you're able to have this conversation about what the point of human life is and therefore what the point of education is. And I think reading Wendell Berry is a great place to start.
Hear, hear. Well, momentarily, when we all leave this wonderful theater, we have a reception in the foyer. And if this is your first time at Heritage, not only welcome again, but there's a beautiful, beautiful scene of Washington, D.C. at night, so enjoy that. But for all of you in the audience and for me, thank you, gentlemen, for a great panel. Thank you for what each of you does for restoring proper education, moral education at university. Please join me in thanking our panel.